The first aliens arrived in Milleville, Ohio when I was still in diapers. By the time I'd graduated into the frilly pink dresses my mother put me in for elementary school, you saw them around occasionally, strolling down Main Street or picnicking by the bandshell in the park. They'd bought into a rundown neighborhood in the east end of town, primarily Polish and Estonian to that point. Though once the aliens began picking up mortgages over there, most people just called it Bugtown. This was lazy thinking because the aliens didn't look anything like bugs. But what are you going to do? I never really had much personal contact with them until their kids started showing up in my high school classes. There was grumbling, of course, but who was going to tell a hulking 7-foot alien his kid couldn't come to school? And so I studied Great Expectations and home economics in the company of creatures not of this earth, which sounds more dramatic than it really was. We all got along well enough in class, even if we did keep to our own sides of the lunchroom, which is where it might have ended if it hadn't been for my best friend, Joan Hayden. The first thing you have to understand about Joan is that she had poor taste in boys. Everybody agreed. First, there'd been Luke Jackson, a disaffected former jock who'd been kicked off the football team when he showed up at the homecoming game half in the bag. After that, she'd taken up with a guy named Jimmy Ford, violating the unspoken divide between the kids in calculus and the ones in shop. That was about the time Joan got clumsy, started slipping in the shower and running into doors. So when she worked up the courage to send Jimmy packing, we all agreed that she was well shut of him, which brings us to Johnny Fabriano, where this story really gets underway. Johnny looked like a refugee from the wild ones. Black leather jacket, motorcycle boots, and a greasy DA that looked like it hadn't been washed in a week. He dropped out of high school the day he'd turned 16 and had spent the last 5 years hanging around Red's billiards parlor, cadging cigarettes and hustling pool. He was a dead shot, and rumor had it he'd won his car in a hotly contested game of 8-ball with a gearhead from Brookton. The car itself was the envy of every would-be greaser in town. A chopped 49 Mercury coupe painted a glossy midnight purple with stylized tongues of yellow and red flame licking at the hood and fenders. Joan had already gotten a reputation for being fast. Undeserved, I have to put in. And if anyone knew, I did, because Joan confided everything in me. She'd moved in next door when we were both in 2nd grade, and we'd been joined at the hip ever since, sharing every joy and affliction, from scraped knees to first periods, which when Joan's made its debut, I remember how jealous I was. Until mine happened along 2 months later, inflicting such misery upon me that I have never envied anyone anything ever since. Or almost never anyway. Joan had grown up in a Pentecostal church, daughter to a strict disciplinarian who saw himself as the earthly agent of the Lord. And if at one level Joan rejected all that, at another level she still believed. You never really escape your childhood training, I guess, and it was this division in Joan's personality that ultimately caused all the trouble. For while Johnny Fabriano was a perfect candidate to give her father an apoplexy, he was also a young man with an agenda of his own. You see where this is going? Of course, and it's not a happy place. But when the alien got involved, his good intentions only made everything worse. Good intentions usually do. My name is Nancy Miller, by the way, and it's nice to meet you, I'm sure. If you haven't already figured it out, this story isn't really mine to tell, but my mother always called me Chatty Cathy, so I suppose it's only natural that it should fall to me in the end. And it's important that you understand that I wasn't always on the scene. Much of what follows is reconstructed from secondhand reports with all the bias and self-interest inherent in such accounts. In short, these are the facts as I understand them. If you want the truth, you'll have to sort it out for yourself. You always do, I guess. So cast me in a supporting role. Plain-faced confidant and collaborator to the beautiful lead. Joan really was beautiful too, which is to say blonde and buxom in the slightly Zaftig mold then in fashion. She inspired plenty of interest among the boys at Milledgeville High, but as I've already said, she never returned the affections of the boys who might have brought her happiness. If happiness was even an option for her, and I think it probably wasn't. Certainly it wasn't with Johnny Fabriano. Like I said, he had an agenda of his own, and if on Joan's part he was calculated to infuriate her father, then there's some small irony that had it not been for her father, they might never have met in the first place. Sometimes just stopping for gas can change the entire course of your life. And that's exactly what happened when her father decided to swing their old caddy into Staley's Gulf Station one September Sunday after church. Gas stations were full service back then. The days of pumping your own fuel were still decades away. And while Mr. Staley fussed with the caddy's tire pressure, Johnny's '49 Merc roared up to the neighboring pump. Both Joan and her father knew the car, of course. Who hadn't seen it around town? And Joan at least knew its driver by reputation. What she didn't know was what a sweet smile Johnny had. But he did. I can vouch for that myself. And when he turned his head to look at Joan, he passed one to her like a gift. Maybe it would have ended there, a shared smile in a gas station parking lot, but Joan's father couldn't help weighing in on the matter. "What a cheap hood," he said, pouring into those two words all the disdain that only those certain of their place in heaven can summon. That was enough for Joan, of course. As her father wheeled the car out into the street, she smiled back at Johnny. When she told me about it that night, she was almost incandescent with excitement. So I wasn't surprised when she contrived an excuse to walk by Red's billiards parlor after school the next day. Johnny's car was parked at the curb outside, and just as we came abreast of the place, I could already see Joan calculating her odds of coaxing me inside. Who should appear in the door but Johnny himself, with a cigarette tucked behind his ear and a toothpick in his mouth. He did a double take, looked Joan up and down, and granted her another smile. It was like the sun coming out from behind a cloud, that smile. I practically melted myself, and he didn't even know I was there. "Gas station girl," he said, and Joan said, "I'm surprised you remember." "Remember?" he said. "How could I forget?" He did some dexterous little trick with his tongue and passed the toothpick from one side of his mouth to the other. "You got a name, gas station girl?" So she told him her name, and then she said, "You're Johnny Fabriano. I know you." You could yet see it pleased him, her knowing his name like that. The way they were looking at each other, it could only go one way and nowhere good. So I stepped in front of her and held out my hand, hoping to forestall the inevitable. "I'm Nancy," I said. He ignored the hand and dipped his chin to acknowledge me. "How you doing, Nancy?" he said, and then taking me by the shoulders, he steered me gently to the side. "Where you girls heading?" he asked. But it was really Joan he was speaking to. "Just walking. Not that way. Not unless you're planning to pay Bugtown a visit." Which was true. We'd already reached the end of the line, unless we wanted to stop in for drinks at some dive with sawdust on the floor, and Nobody's Lonesome for Me on the jukebox. Bugtown lay beyond, and Bugtown was forbidden territory. It had been abandoned to the aliens, and those who did work up the spit to visit wouldn't say much, except that it was catching strange. It was the catching part of that phrase that concerned our parents. For those who spent much time in Bugtown often became odd themselves. They got a faraway look in their eyes, as if they were listening to some distant music that no one else could hear, and drifted into silence. Once in a while, you heard about some daring kid making a midnight run through the place, tires screeching. But details were mighty slim on the ground. It was always a friend of a friend of a friend, no one you ever knew. So I figured such after-hours adventures for empty boasts. In short, the aliens walked among us, but we did not walk among the aliens. Which is why, when Johnny asked if we were planning an excursion of our own, I was shocked when Joan shrugged and said, "Sure we are." Johnny, on the other hand, didn't blink an eye. "Maybe you'd like a ride instead." "We'll walk," I said, taking Joan's elbow. "Home." I was wasting my breath. "Sounds like fun to me," Joan said, prying my fingers loose, and I knew then that it was a lost cause. There was the car, there was the smile, and there was the cheap hood himself. Her father already loathed him. So when she said, "You coming, Nance?" I said the only thing I could in response. "No, Joan, and you shouldn't go either." Like I said, wasting my breath. A minute later, Johnny keyed the Merc's engine to life and they roared off down Main Street. This time, Joan really had gone too far, I thought, as I walked home alone, and at the time I had no idea just how far she'd gone.